Hello everyone, I'm going to be editing that part out. Welcome back to Tomlinson Talks. It just hasn't been my day, has it? Well, I'm glad that we finally got the Longhouse stream off to a good start, because everyone has been saying in the chat, in comments across the week, where on earth is the Longhouse stream? And it turns out that they even announced a Life is Strange Max and Chloe sequel before I got round to doing this. Other people have said, you know, thank God that this has come out before GTA 6. Which came out in 2013, GTA 5 now, so that game is, like, 13 years old. I felt even older, though, when I realised that Skyrim had come out in 2011, and that means that the next-gen upscale, where they enabled mods on consoles for the first time, is about 10 years old now. So there is a grey patch in my beard that is starting to spread for a good reason. I do hope, though, that the demand for this stream on the Longhouse, long anticipated, is reflected in YouTube's viewing figures, because just between you and me, those under 18, cover your ears, the YouTube algorithm has been screwing me into the dirt for the last week, to the extent to where pretty much everything I've put out, other than my Oxford Union speech, and that took 2 days to take off, has disappeared like a fart in the wind. And it seems that, judging by my analytics, nobody that's actually subscribed to me is getting anything in their subscription feeds, or is getting any notifications. So I know it's trite at this point when people say, you know, click the notification bell and all this, but if you haven't got it enabled, there's a reason that you aren't seeing any of my videos. The only way any of it gets viewed is apparently through YouTube suggestions or direct search, so I'm being throttled for some god unknown reason. But anyway, hope you're all seeing this, hope it's all going well. So, before we start off with the planned topic of the Great Feminization and the transformation of the British state into a technological longhouse, a panopticon, by Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood's own description, I wanted to start out with this text exchange with a journalist. We use journalist in the expansive definition here. Smear merchant by the looks of it. From the New Humanist magazine, whose name I decided to redact so people that can't, you know, dogpile on this particular individual, though you'll know who it is whenever the article's published, and if it's any good laugh, we'll go for it on stream. But I was reached out to via Substack, and this journalist said that they were writing on Christianity and the manosphere, not something that usually intersects, given the disproportionately Muslim commentator and audience makeup of the manosphere. The red pill's looking awfully brown these days. And they said they wanted to chat with me about my various posts and videos on feminism and the role of society. And I responded quite cordially. This was the entire exchange. I'll just collapse this post. I'm not sure what the angle is, but I've never considered myself part of the manosphere. I've laid out my criticisms of it a couple of years ago for being too materialistic and polygamist in an essay that I linked to. Hopefully this helps. I've always thought the manosphere, like many ideologies, obscures the true nature of relationships and is inadvertently feminist in that it reacts to the feminist framing. It engages in a zero-sum resource competition with the most misandric, man-hating feminists who conceive of the world as dichotomized into the competing groups of men and women who instead are inextricably reliant on one another, who should serve one another with love and deference to their specific spheres of competence. And so, I don't think it's a particularly helpful way of framing things, even if various iterations or figures in the manosphere have raised completely legitimate points, like fathers being disadvantaged in divorce courts. You can see my old interview with my friend Jeff Younger on my old show, on the Lotus Eaters, for that particular topic. So, by and large, don't get me wrong, men's rights activists have done good work, and that work remains unfinished. But the manosphere itself, as it's evolved into gender slop content like Fresh and Fit and Andrew Tate and Pearl Davis, just seems to be, and whatever podcast as well, serial offender of this, seems to be a resentful defensive posture against porn and feminism, while also platforming that porn and feminism, being at once a existential cry against it, and also basically an advert for it. So anyway, all of that was entailed in the article I linked to this person. The reason I'm featuring this is because you're going to get a kick out of the response I got, first of all. So the immediate response I got was, "Hi Connor, thanks for getting back to me. I know you don't see yourself as part of the manosphere, so why are you interviewing me? But many of the points you make in your videos on the way women should behave echo the misogyny we see from those embedded in red pill culture." Just a hint for any journalists out there, but if someone has zero incentive to engage with you because they don't know who you are, you're not paying them for their time, and they probably don't share your political priors, given your magazine's called New Humanist and I'm a Catholic, maybe don't go about insulting them in the first or the follow-up text, because they're going to be disinclined to give you what you want. Anyway, she wrote, "The difference, as I see it, is that you recommend women be subservient to men because it is the natural order of things as per Christianity, rather than because they owe you their bodies." I'm guessing that you haven't actually read the Bible. It explains why you're a humanist, where it says that wives submit to your husbands, but also husbands make sacrifices for, submit to your wives as Christ did for the church, as in, be prepared to lay down your life for your family. Make the ultimate sacrifice. Lend your strength in defending those who are dependent on you for that strength. Because it turns out men and women are biologically different, and so men, on average, are stronger than women. See the recent video, just absolutely hilarious, of a bunch of bodybuilding dwarves versus really tall bodybuilding women that almost definitely aren't on steroids, and the dwarves just demolish them. Because men and women are different, even when you adjust for drastic differences in height. So, given that difference, men and women have different roles that complement and serve one another. They're not engaged in a zero-sum game for resource competition with the premise that all things could be equal if the hidden hand of arbitrary patriarchal oppression weren't tipping the scales one way or the other. Nina Power has this term called sibling economy, where men and women are now less Adam and Eve than Cain and Abel, constantly fighting, squabbling like siblings, and that sort of incestuous relationship means that relationships become impossible in and of themselves. So refusing to deny sexual difference is at the root of this tearing one's hair out over the idea that men and women should make sacrifices for one another in different ways. Anyway, she says, "Your views on promiscuity vary from those of the manosphere." That's, stating it mildly. "But your opinion that women deliberately use DEI to belittle men and should avoid sharing pictures of themselves online because it cheapens them are not that far removed from those of the men who follow Tate et al." Actually, it is, because Andrew Tate runs a porn business. So it's completely different, actually. And as far as women using DEI to belittle men, not as an abstract category, women versus men. Some women do, which is what we're going to go through in this stream. She says, "The difference is that you frame it as a reason for men to teach women how to be good humans. Men and women tend to civilize one another because morality resides in the relationships you have with other people. Like, you can practice and cultivate virtue on your own, but you can't claim to be virtuous if your virtue is never put to the test, and it's only put to the test in interactions with other people. Even Christ had to be tempted by the devil in the desert in order for him to demonstrate his virtue." Anyway, she says, "Ultimately, the outcome of both schools of thought is the same. Women must submit to the rules, beliefs of a man if they're to be worth anything." It's just a completely uncharitable characterization of my position, and also men must have their worth validated might be the wrong word, but there are two roles for men and women, right? There's spiritual fatherhood or motherhood, or actual fatherhood or motherhood. So joining the clergy, taking a vow of celibacy, and becoming someone of great philosophical and theological wisdom. There's always been a place for those sort of monks and priests and nuns in various societies, the sort of priestly class. But then, other than that, the vocation for most people, for most men and women, save the warrior who dies in battle, but even then they usually have sons to remember them, carry on the legacy, that's what they're fighting for, is to couple up with the opposite sex and raise children. So, turns out, if women are to be worth something in a social role, a broader community, to be situated in a meaningful society, to have a fulfilling life, they typically want to be mothers, they typically want to be wives, they typically want to, as they age, be elder stateswomen. And the same goes for men. So, this just reads like the resentful tract of someone who is incapable of maintaining a healthy relationship without seeing themselves in zero-sum competition with the entire opposite sex. So anyway, I just responded with, we don't know each other, so to open with you hate women gives me no incentive to engage with this. The time I spend with my wife, mother, grandmothers, friends, etc. matters more to me than if someone I don't know calls me mean on the internet. Men should be considerate, compassionate, and chivalric towards the women they love and who love them. Women should return that compassion and consideration in kind. We may do it in different ways, but that's the core of it. Ideology obscures those relationships, makes people think in zero-sum terms about competing categories, and is making people miserable. So you're welcome to engage with what I've written and said throughout my career, and I hope you do so in good faith, but I don't feel compelled to defend myself against such a bad faith charge as you're a misogynist. I'd rather spend time with my wife. So what relevance does this have to the broader stream? Twofold. This is the dichotomy we're facing. Men and women who watch my content, it turns out there's like 15 to 20% of my audience that's women. I suppose you don't have much better to do, but thank you for being here. Those of us who engage in this kind of discourse think in relational terms. We think in terms of loyalty and honesty and trust and duty and reciprocity and moral consideration. All of these sort of thick conceptual things that require you to be personally virtuous and you to demonstrate that virtue to another person with the expectation that they are capable of manifesting equal moral dignity and kind. These are all quite dense concepts, whereas ideology thins out those concepts and says if you just have the right ideas that you can be programmed into believing, and you inflict them upon reality, regardless of whether or not, regardless of the friction that generates and the suffering that results, you are a good person. And it's that ideological position that has inhabited Britain's institutions. That's why it's become a Longhouse. That's why it has succumbed to what Helen Andrews calls the Great Feminization. And we're going to be going through some of those famous Compact Mag articles and reading them in the light of this kind of contest. Because this is how I think the right should be thinking about formulating its rediscovery of traditions. It's not about forming a cargo cult of the past. It's about rejuvenating those bonds of relationships between men and women, not as abstract categories, but as real, named, living people. Those families, those congregations, those local communities, those communities around shared interest, around reciprocity and recognition. And then that scales up to your country, and it provides you with a thing that you might want to defend if tested. And not defend in some sort of abstract war for NATO to go and die in a ditch in Ukraine as the new feminist female head of MI6 is proposing, but rather an existential struggle for the fate of your civilization that you want to pass off onto your kin out of gratitude for all of the sacrifices that your ancestors made so that you could inherit the current state of things as they are. With the, yes, they're dwindling prosperity and cultural amnesia, but nevertheless, these are the fruits of great struggle and sacrifice that those became before us made. So we should have gratitude for that. And the other reason I've showed this is because if you're watching, journalist in question, have fun quote mining this stream because there's going to be plenty for you. Anyway, so I thought we'd start off with this New Statesman article written by Scarlett Maguire, who goes on GB News quite a lot actually, and she's quite an insightful pollster. She works for JL Partners Polls. I met James of JL Partners in Washington, DC last year. Good chat, friend of Steve Edgington, so he's doing some solid work. And we spend a lot of time, and I have personally on my trigonometry episode that's almost 2 years old now, and was a bit ahead of the curve really, talking about the young men going quite rapidly to the right. Not right-wing parties, but in terms of rediscovering tradition, having a personal rebellion against woke progressive feminism, because it gives them absolutely no incentive to buy into the system by treating them like the avatars of unjust, historical, racial, and sexual oppression. Well, we don't spend actually that much time talking about the radicalization of young women. There's been a lot of gender slop discourse about the Great Gender Divide, which didn't manifest as badly as feared in the United States at the last presidential election, because I think the New York Times was reporting something like a 54-point gender gap between young men supporting Trump and young women voting Kamala Harris, and it didn't manifest as badly. And it turns out because a lot of young women who care about the men they love in their lives and want to be aspirational things like attractive and successful and loved in return don't think abort all your children, allow a man in a dress to break into your changing room and beat you in your swim meet, and allow your entire bloodline to go extinct because otherwise you're doing a racism. Turns out that's not a really compelling sales pitch to a lot of young women. Hey presto, you're getting the Amelia meme, you're getting loads of French feminists standing up against mass migration and getting cracked down by it for the government, and you got that Cruel Kids Club photograph from the inauguration party that my friend Chris Barnard organised. It was on the front cover of New York Magazine with the article written by a rather sexually confused individual. Let's put it that way, because we're on YouTube, and I'm not sure what gets you demonetised these days. But in Britain, we are seeing a runaway, radical, progressive preference cascade for the Green Party among young women that isn't being reflected in parallel for young men on the right. And I think that's because there isn't, as of yet, an authentic right-wing force that also codes youthful, exuberant, and online, which is where a lot of these young men are getting their politics, despite the prophesized massive TikTok following that Nigel Farage keeps saying he's having. There is a negligible capture of young men by Reform UK, whereas young women far and away are voting for the ecological, sexually liberatory Camp of the Saints coalition of resentful foreigners that have coalesced around the Green Party. So anyway, Scarlett's written this piece in the New Statesman. She says, frustrated and overly online young men, hello, are widely seen to be the drivers of a quiet revolution that has been taking place in youth politics, widening the gender gap. Yet not enough thought has been given to young women's much greater movement in the opposite direction. But at the last general election, young 18 to 24-year-old men were twice as likely as young women to vote Reform, while young women were twice as likely to vote Green as young men. But a smaller percentage of young men voted for Reform, 12%, than the general population, 14.3%, whereas in America, Gen Z and Gen X were much more likely, the millennials and boomers, to vote for Trump. Actually, 18 to 24-year-old men were far less likely to have voted Farage than every other cohort of men. 68% voted Labour, Lib Dem or Green, and only 22% voted Conservative or Reform. And saying the Conservative Party are a right-wing party is a bit of a stretch. So you could quite easily put the Conservative vote in the left-wing party category. It seems that Kemi Badenoch is certainly determined to make it into one. By this metric, young men were some of the least radical demographic groups of the whole country. So what we're seeing is a rising tide of cultural discontent among young men, be it manifesting in edgy Instagram content or Twitter anons, or the large share of my audience which is under 30, as well as that of the Lotus Eaters or someone like Paul Joseph Watson. But it's not translating into voting patterns. And I think that's because there isn't an authentically right-wing representation for that yet. We'll see what Rupert Lowe cooks up, I suppose, or if Reform decide to tack rightward and occupy that vacant space in the Overton window. But Scarlett has pointed out, nearly 1 in 4, so it's 23%, 18 to 24-year-old women voted for the Green Party at the last general election, compared to 6.7% of the general population, so 12% of young men voted for the Greens. This is mirrored in Germany. I think it's like young men are 4 or 5 points more likely than the national average to vote for AfD, and AfD is a centre-right party led by a lesbian woman in an interracial relationship, so hardly the second incarnation of Adolf Hitler, you know. No aura farming edits there, ladies and gentlemen. But among young women, I think they're about 25 points more likely to vote for Die Linke, the Communist Party which has transgender representatives. So we're seeing a runaway progressivism among young women, and they are becoming the foot soldiers manufacturing consent for what the feminists in government already want to do. So there is a Bertrand de Juvenalian higher, lower, compacting power structure here of social media and campus and street level activism among young women for progressive causes, and the liberal, progressive, globalist, managerialist class running international institutions or national governments like the Labour Party, squeezing the net tax contributing native white male populations who are discontented with both the top and bottom, but have no concrete political representation and are actively discriminated against in their own laws, and so find it hard to get ahead. And the moment they stick their heads above the parapet and complain about it, like I do, we all get called all sorts of names and have hit pieces written on us by the general press. Brilliant. Anyway, the Greens performed far better with young women than with any other key demographic. Just 10% of 25 to 49-year-old women voted Green, and only 4% of 50 to 64-year-olds. So young women are radically progressive, and that is behind the growing Green Party constituency under tit whisperer Zach Polanski. Maybe that's why. Recent data from More in Common shows that 1 in 3 young women will now vote for the Green Party, whereas young men, far from being more right-wing than the population as a whole, are as likely to vote Green as they are Reform, 20%. We've got to rescue our brothers from Reddit, ladies and gentlemen. Like, we can't have our young guys out there. Well, actually, okay. Allow me to pause. Adam Wren has this rule. Good Twitter account, go and follow him. Where if there is any inexplicable demographic, any inexplicable political trend, can be explained by unprecedented demographic trends. So, any inexplicable political trend can be explained by unprecedented demographic trends. And it may enlighten you all to know that the share of those under 24, for example, immigrant groups like Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, is double that of white Brits. So about 22% of white Brits are under the age of 24, whereas it's about 45% for Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, respectively. So the larger immigrant cohort clustering around the bottom percentiles of age brackets in our country would probably explain why so many young men are willing to vote for the we'll steal white people stuff immigrant party, the Greens. In previous decades, young women were actually more likely to vote Conservative than men. And this is a glimmer of hope, by the way. Young women, I think it was, stopped the Attlee government from getting a second term. Because women, as Dave Green discussed on his recent podcast, women enforce rules within the boundaries that men set through force. So, if the cultural incentives are conservative, are pro-family, Christian, pro-civilization, police the in-group preference, put it that way, women will police those boundaries militantly. Think the characters in J.B. Priestley's and Inspector Calls, where they are interested in preserving the family's wealth, they're interested in anti-socialist attitudes, and they tie strict standards of moral propriety to the charity that women's institutes dole out. Much better time. And subversive fiction like that help bring it down. So there is a potential for a revival of this culture, and therefore a preference cascade in that direction among women. And so this is the kind of negotiation that men and women have to have about the proper place for one another in a society. At the moment, it seems like young women are intent on destroying that society. So this is the main problem. It's not just the dispossession and loneliness and discrimination against men. It's the fact that young women are high on suicidal empathy and pouring political acid over the foundations of their own civilization while also trying to cling on to the fictions of egalitarianism and human rights. Can't have both, I'm afraid. By the way, just a reminder, I will be addressing super chats if they come in at the end of the show. I have seen one come in so far. If there are any that are pertinent and relevant, I will do so as we go. You'll also have to forgive me. I have an itch in my ear, which is really frustrating when the camera is on. So, look, Scarlett has laid out that young women are indoctrinated to vote against their long-term self-interest. They also feel less connected to their country than young men, and are 21 points more likely to think the country is racist than young men, 58% to 37%. I think it's racist. I think it's just racist against white guys, and there are a lot of reasons to think so. Young women are the most pessimistic group when it comes to the UK economy, with an astonishingly low net economic optimism score of -57, 18 points worse than men of that age group. Now, you would be thinking, why? Because women are technically out-earning men now, because they have a much higher degree of university degree attainment. The gender pay gap has slightly inverted, especially among young men and women under 30. And the pay gap didn't exist in the first place because it was just comparing apples and oranges. It was comparing men as a category and women as a category, and the overall amount of economic output they generated without adjusting for hours worked, profession, time taken off work, because women have to physically bear children. So the fact that it has inverted is a result entirely of economic and legislative gerrymandering that discriminates against men as a category in favour of women as a category, pitting them in a zero-sum game for resource competition, which doesn't benefit either of them, hence why women are so upset. And also, this is kind of a vibrometer, right? So I think young men's economic dispossession is tempered by the amount of resources they can acquire, because that was historically the way that a man proved his worth, not just to his fellow men, but also to women, because women don't want a loser. They don't want to be a man's mother. They want to be his wife. Like, this is just sensible. If women want what they want in life, they want a guy who can give it to them, right? Makes perfect sense. Somehow that's going to be contentious in the article that gets written about this stream, but who cares? My wife's happy. I don't care if you want. I think that this is a demonstration that the economy doesn't work for women, because it's set up in such a way that is not just alien to how men used to earn money, you know, have their son as an apprentice, work within the village, often work with their hands rather than in a floodlit office cubicle, you know, tapping away on a computer in an insurance job like Mr. Incredible when he could be out there lifting trains over his head. Metaphorically speaking, of course, but you should be getting in shape. That is alienating to men. Now, think about how stressful it is to most women who have a ambient anxiety level much higher than men, who are surrounded by lots of untrustworthy people when commuting into a city, who don't enjoy the deracinated social environment of modern work if you are actually working, or are funneled into jobs that are basically adult daycare where all you do is socialize and don't actually produce anything worthwhile beyond a few emails or a spreadsheet or two, if they're working in some sort of tech firm, which is entirely unsustainable. And in either respect, they're giving most of their time away to a corporation that is indifferent as to whether or not they're happy or have children. So it's a very alienating process. It's not serving young women any more than it is serving young men. And so I think women's economic pessimism is not a measure of whether or not they are legally advantaged or actually earning decent income. It's a measure of just how they feel about their lives. And shockingly, to most leftists who don't understand the rebalancing of the political axis among younger people, they might be surprised to hear this. I think we should completely reconfigure our economic structure to ensure that men and women are actually happy. Fuck the GDP. It's a meaningless metric anyway. 1 in 3 women, and this is how dispossessed women are of their own country and have estranged their locus of moral concern from themselves and projected it onto abstract, hypothetical, categorical minority groups like immigrants or Gaza. 1 in 3 of 16 to 25-year-old women say the conflict in Gaza is in their top 3 issues, placing it above things like taxes and immigration. Just 22% of young men say the same. So that's a portion of course, young Muslim men and also left-wing men. So this is just women setting their political priorities as to what comes across their Instagram feeds, and what they think is a approved belief to continue to gain access to the social club. None of this is good. it is just spiking the cortisol in women over issues that should not be pertinent to them. Like, if you are more concerned about either Israel or Gaza than the health of your own country and your own countrymen, then you have taken a misstep in calibrating your political priorities. I think that is fair to say. 84% of women say they use TikTok regularly compared to 67% of men, and that's the under 24s. So that explains their skewed political priorities and their general sense of misery. Young men are more likely than women to use X, but in much smaller numbers than women use TikTok, 46% to 26%. Hello to all my fellow Anons. Well, I don't have an Anon burner account, actually, but, you know, spiritually linked. Online media consumption seems to be worrying young women more than men, who are far more likely to say they spend far too much time on social media, 49% of 18 to 24-year-old women, compared to 36% of men the same age. Online media consumption, higher education, with 56% of university degrees now owned by women, and even relationship status all seem to drive the increasingly different political outlooks from young men and young women. The political gap between those that are single is even more pronounced than between those that are married. And this is very important. Meeting a woman who, or a man, in the case of my female viewers, who shares your existential vision of the good life, regardless of political party, is a more important determining factor of your psychological health and well-being than your involvement in politics. And the future will be determined not by these resentful, single, ideologically captured hordes of progressive women, but instead by married couples who win the demographic arms race. Allow me to put it that way. But at the moment, for the foreseeable future, young women are being taught to hate themselves, their civilization, and men as a category by the social media content and the message they receive from the state. And this should be a priority of existential proportions. If, 1 in 3 pregnancies are being aborted, if the same number of pregnancies that have ended in abortion over a significant time period, I forget, it's the last few decades, maps onto the same number of foreign nationals brought into our country. It's like 1-to-1 demographic replacement. If fewer people are getting married than historic norms, if people are having children at later ages than historic norms, if the native birth rate is beneath that of the immigrant birth rate, and the way that culture is passed down is from parent to child, all of these should be significant concerns to the government if they were interested in serving our nation. But instead, the British government is going to introduce Minority Report. The British government, under Keir Starmer, because of his good friend Sir Tony Blair, and his good friend Larry Ellison at Oracle, are going to introduce AI-based pre-crime policing. And this was discussed during a conversation at the Tony Blair Institute with Shabana Mahmood. Now, I think this was their Christmas party event where she said, "We can do God, actually," and she's referring to Allah. Shabana Mahmood said, "AI and technology can be transformative to the whole of law and order. When I was in Justice, as the Justice Secretary, who almost allowed literal 2-tier sentencing guidance to pass, where straight white Christian men would have gotten harsher sentences for the same penalties committed, disproportionately by the way, by non-white, non-Christian perpetrators, as well as the disabled, pregnant people and women, and LGBTQ, ever-expanding acronym people. That woman wants to introduce an AI surveillance state. She says, "When I was in Justice, my ultimate vision for that part of the criminal justice system was to achieve, by means of AI and technology, what Jeremy Bentham tried to do with his panopticon. That is, that the eyes of the state can be on you at all times." That's a direct quote. She wants a digital eye of Sauron in the middle of Britain, watching you permanently. Similarly, she said, in the world of policing in particular, we've already been rolling out live facial recognition technology. But I think there's big space here for being able to harness the power of AI and tech to get ahead of the criminals, frankly, which is what we're trying to do. Right, so what's going to happen is Oracle, which is already hooked up to various government departments. This is something I covered, by the way, in my recent video on why Nigel Farage is at the World Economic Forum at the moment, and I accurately predicted that he was going to go there and say, I'm going to do a speech insulting the woke globalists to their face. Meanwhile, he's going to broker business deals with people from Dubai and America and Israel and meet international heads of state to set himself up as the presumptive next party of government. But anyway, in this video, I went through a New Statesman piece that detailed the extensive links between the Tony Blair Institute and Larry Ellison's Oracle. And Oracle is a large data processing and AI development firm, which is already enmeshed with the Department of Health, the Department for Science and Technology, and the Treasury, HMRC. So they are going to have a synergized government database. This is what they're trying to push using digital ID, that collects all of your personal information, likely including your social media history, by the way, so it makes it even easier to identify and prosecute thought criminals via social media posts online. And then they're going to hook that up with facial recognition cameras. So let's say that you have made a naughty post online, and you're not at home when the police want to, kick your door down at 3 a.m. Instead, you're just out walking the street after a night out. Well, if a facial recognition camera detects you, they can send a police van up to go and snatch you off the street because of a tweet. Pronto. And this is exactly what Shabana Mahmood wants. No exaggeration. She said it. She wants a digital panopticon where the eyes of the state can be on you at all times. Okay. This is the kind of civilization that Britain's government, under Keir Starmer, want to build. And I did predict that this was basically going to be the architecture of the British state back in a talk I gave at the Family Education Trust conference last summer. And I said that the way this is being set up is with 3 different structures. That's the Longhouse, the Panopticon, and the Global Village. We're going to talk about 2 of those today. The Global Village is a slightly different concept. It comes from Marshall McLuhan, where the guy who said the medium is the message. The idea is that technology expands the horizon of homogenization through interconnectivity and creates one global monoculture, which is why Twitter has basically turned into a giant international shantytown now, since India and Pakistan have been brought online, because the low-trust scamming culture of those countries doesn't mix well with the individualistic, liberal and Christian culture of largely Anglo-Protestant Europe. And so we're going to marginalize that for now. And instead we're going to focus on the top left one here, which is the Panopticon. So that is a 360 prism with a guard tower in the center, which can see into all prison cells, see what all prisoners are doing at all times. And it was actually discarded as a plan because it was deemed too cruel, too psychologically torturous for its inhabitants. But that's exactly what the current sitting Home Secretary, who's being primed to be Britain's first Muslim Prime Minister by Tony Blair, who is pulling the strings of Keir Starmer's government, that is exactly what she envisions for the future of our country. And the reason I said about this is because the way that technology ratchets upward requires you to live in a panopticon for the state to oversee the tensions between communities. Basically, it's imported client groups, those that it considers to be deserving of protections for their characteristics. And so that means that pretty much everyone else who is deemed to be a threat to these protected characteristics will be living in the prison cells of the panopticon. And that means just straight white men. The bottom of the progressive stack. But the other structure that I compared modern states to, particularly Britain, is the Longhouse, the image that you can see on screen. Now, if you're not familiar with the analogy of the Longhouse, it was first popularized by Lomez, Jonathan Keeperman. His nom de plume has since been revealed by a resentful Guardian journalist who doxed him a couple of years ago. But Keeperman, while he was still an anon, wrote in First Things about the Longhouse, and He wrote that the historical Longhouse was a large communal hall serving as the social focal point for many cultures and peoples throughout the world that were typically more sedentary and agrarian. This is not the same as a Viking Longhouse, which did have an element of hierarchy in it. Instead, the Longhouse that Keeperman talks about here is similar to the sort of giant Native American wigwam, or various hypothetical modern matriarchal societies that various feminist theorists like Simone de Beauvoir base their wild fantasies of a post-patriarchal society on. Total bunk anthropology, similar to the blank slate, but this liberal myth-making persists, and it is a strong analogy for how our current matriarchal, spiritually at the very least, matriarchal, feminist institutions are being run. Keeperman wrote, in online discourse, this historical function gets generalized to contemporary patterns of social organization, in particular the exchange of privacy and its attendant autonomy from the modest comforts and security of collective living. The most important feature of the Longhouse, and why it makes such a resonant and controversial symbol of our current circumstances, is the ubiquitous role of the den mother. More than anything, the Longhouse refers to the remarkable overcorrection of the last two generations towards social norms centering feminine needs and feminine methods for controlling, directing, and modeling behavior. So envision the Longhouse, a large structure in which all people live on one single floor. There are no hierarchies, there are no walls, and at the center, presiding over it, like a female guard tower of a panopticon, is a woman who resolves all conflicts, who has a mind for equality and the resolution, the peaceful resolution of disputes, who centralizes and redistributes all resources, and if you displease her, she will shun and banish you, and under the guise of compassion, cast you out into the wilderness where you will die of exposure or starvation. So this egalitarian, but fundamentally matriarchal and cruel structure is the exact format of our current institutions. As described by Shabana Mahmood, she wants a digital AI-powered panopticon Longhouse, a panopticon with a bright pink tower, basically. And Mahmood is not the only person in the current Labour cabinet that's building this structure, because we got the news late last year that now the Department for Education is going to tell boys to respect women. Now, as you can see, and I know the zoomer perm might throw you off, the thumbnail of this image is conspicuously a young white lad. Unless the lessons are being delivered in Urdu, and even then, they're not going to work, this entire curriculum is pointless. Yet again, the demographic composition of younger people helps explain all the sexual assaults and misogynistic attitudes. And misogyny as defined, for example, by being fans of Andrew Tate, this sort of bogeyman that lives in the mind of the present Labour government and every feminist everywhere. Turns out young white guys aren't that big a fan of Andrew Tate, as we'll go through in a bit. But, it says here, all boys will be taught how to respect women and girls as part of the school curriculum under government plans to deploy the full power of the state to crack down on male violence and misogyny. Britain is turning into a panopticon to fight women's feelings being hurt. You see how that exchange at the start of the broadcast was basically a microcosm for the battle between young men in school and the British state, young men trying to get a job and the British state, young men generally, and the culture extolled by the state. Teachers will give lessons on how children should challenge misogynistic comments and behaviour and to promote healthy relationships. This isn't going to backfire spectacularly, because I know what I would have loved sitting back in school, which I already hated as a young man, because pretty much all precocious, boisterous, energetic young lads hate being told to sit still, shut up, and listen to things that aren't relevant to them for 8 hours a day. I know that I would have just loved being henpecked by a teacher that I didn't respect, being told that I just didn't respect women enough, and that I deserve to be disadvantaged and discriminated against even more than I currently am. Official government advice will also help teachers and parents to spot signs that children are being radicalised by online misogynists such as Andrew Tate and how they can intervene early. I think this curriculum, by the way, was pretty premature because Andrew Tate, who I've never been a fan of, pimp turned imam, has kind of lost a bit of credibility after going on Patrick Bet-David's show and denouncing his friends after that sort of like cringe club outing the other day. So it turns out that they kind of bought the dip on Andrew Tate scaremongering here. Never let it be said the British government isn't ahead of the curve. The plans will be part of a wide-ranging package of measures to be announced as part of the government's long-awaited violence against women and girls strategy. I've got a solution for you. Mass deportations. Just deport all the people that are committing sex crimes against the women and girls. You could even set up like a prison colony on Pitcairn or Ascension Island to send all of the actual violent offenders to. No? Oh no, you're letting them out of prison early instead. Right. You just want to culturally brainwash an entire generation of men and expect this won't have a massive political backlash. Oh, and they're also, of course, trying to ban social media for under 16s, which I support in principle, but the only reason they're doing this is because men have access to non-progressive opinions outside of school, outside of mainstream media, online, on social media, from people like me. So the government is trying to stop manosphere or non-woke traditionalist, patriotic influencers and commentators from telling young men, actually, feeling like you're hated by your culture in every institution, including your school and government, isn't unjust, and here's why. That's what they're worried about. It was a key pledge in Labour's 2024 election manifesto, but internal battles over the scope of the policies, funding, and how to measure male violence against women have led to repeated delays. A Home Office source insisted ministers had taken time to make the final strategy as ambitious and bold as possible to fight the tide of violence, stop abuse, and protect victims. Yet again, immigration reform is not a part of this, so it's not as ambitious and bold as possible. It's just about browbeating men for being men. They added, put together, the strategy will deploy the full power of the state to introduce the largest crackdown to stop violence perpetrated against women and girls in British history. We used to hang rapists in this country, so it's actually not the largest crackdown to stop violence perpetrated against women and girls, because you're not hanging the rapists. So the hyperbolic language, yet again, is just about manufacturing an air of legitimacy about this ideologically demented government. Shahbana Mahmood will begin a policy blitz of announcements from 6 government departments, culminating with the publication of the strategy. The measures have been drawn up to deliver Labour's goal of halving rates of violence against women and girls within a decade. Again, stop importing men from the third world that commit all the crime then. There was an internal Home Office report that concluded that online manosphere content is helping to fuel extreme misogyny and needs to be stopped in its tracks through official government policy. Officials on Home Office, led by Carl Benjamin's old friend Jess Phillips, believe this toxicity is being fueled by the growing popularity and influence of online influencers such as Andrew Tate. A government source involved in drawing up the strategy cited recent polling that found that more than 4 in 10 young men have a positive view of Tate. Yet again, this is based on polling that finds that a very, very slim minority of white men have a positive opinion of Tate, but an overwhelming plurality of young black and young Asian, and that means Middle Eastern, Indian, Pakistani men in Britain, have a positive opinion of Tate. Because Tate's materialistic opulence, his polygamous chauvinism, and his Muslim faith appeals to the sons of immigrants rather than white guys who are sooner to look up to, well, formerly Jordan Peterson, but the heroes of their own civilization, like Robin Hood or Richard the Lionheart. Guy Fawkes, perhaps. And so, not teaching them those heroes leaves them dispossessed, but it's the young men who are the descendants of countries who have lower impulse control, who are more likely to commit those crimes, who then look up to Tate, who then go on to exhibit those attitudes or even pair those attitudes with violence. They're the actual cause of concern for people like Jess Phillips. But of course, Mahmood and Phillips don't want to admit and draw distinctions between those groups unless it is of electoral advantage to them. And so they'll generalise out to all men instead, and not just develop an ineffective strategy, but instead continue to browbeat white boys and dispossess them of their country while putting native girls at risk. Brilliant. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. But the den mother can never draw distinctions between the inhabitants of the Longhouse unless the crime is a person drawing the distinction for which they are banished from the Longhouse and exposed to the elements. Typical. Now, a lot of this comes from, this is a report that I wrote a little while ago for Courage Media. This was December 2024. A lot of this comes from Dame Sarah Khan's paper, which she wrote with her old friends, the communists and perverts, turns out, hope not hate. And in the report from Crest Insights, by the way, Sarah Khan, former counter-extremism commissioner and independent advisor for social cohesion and resilience. Her sister ran Raiku, the Don't Look Back in Anger department. Khan wrote the definition of extremism that was delivered by Michael Gove shortly before the last general election, where he said diversity is our strength. Thanks, Gove. The report claims, among its various findings, that 73% of 16 to 24-year-olds have encountered hateful, violent, or extremist or terrorist content on social media. Very broad there. And 45% of young men have a positive opinion of Andrew Tate. Again, we don't get an ethnic breakdown for this, but we have from other polling. So, Khan's recommendations in the paper that she then sent to the Cabinet Office and the Home Office were to establish a new centralised directorate inside the Cabinet Office to deliver wholesale change in how Whitehall addresses the challenge of preventing democratic decline, strengthening social cohesion, building democratic and social resilience, and countering extremism and other related threats. Hence the massive Cabinet Office body that they've just built with like 6,000 employees to trawl through social media posts and counter-signal them online. And the development of a multi-agency partnership and referral mechanism similar to, but separate from Channel, Prevent, which succeeded so well in countering far-right extremism that it gave us Amelia, everyone's favourite purple-haired goth girl, aimed at under 18s who are vulnerable to extremist activity that falls below the terrorism threshold. Right. So, it doesn't even have to be illegal. It just has to be social media content that the likes of Oracle and Shabana Mahmood's digital panopticon are monitoring that is distasteful to the woke feminist sensibilities of those running our government. And that gets you monitored as if you are a terrorist. This could be led on by the Department for Education, and instead of a securitized or policing approach, would take an educational approach. Educating young men to hate Andrew Tate and setting up a Cabinet Office department to monitor Andrew Tate clips sounds awfully familiar to me. So, communist organisation Hope Not Hate and Muslim activist whose sister ran the gaslighting department of the Home Office that controlled the media response to terror attacks, Dame Sarah Khan, wrote a paper that was then given to the government, that the government then acted on by spying on our social media posts with a digital panopticon, and is now using it to do a anti-misogyny, anti-male curriculum in schools, telling white boys why that they are the problem for everything. Brilliant. We have literal communists and Muslim activists running everything, saying, yet again, that straight white men are the problem. Britain is becoming a technological longhouse. Now, Cooper had already committed to this when she was Home Secretary, back in August of 2024. This was before it was formalised by Khan's paper. And she said that extreme misogyny is going to be considered a terrorist act. Bear in mind, this was like a month after the Southbourne slayings, where they were so obsessed with the far-right and misogyny, but of course weren't tackling the true problem, which is the mass migration of paranoid anti-white African stabbers, like Anthony Williams, or allegedly, or Axel Ruda-Cabana. But instead, Yvette Cooper has ordered a urgent review of counter-extremism that then went on to be the Sprint paper from Raiku that said that the grooming gangs are a grievance narrative invented by the far right, turned into a massive scandal. The review is looking at incels as a category of terrorists, and then it said that teachers will be legally required to refer pupils they suspect of extreme misogyny to Prevent. So you can get referred to the anti-terror program, not increasingly if you're a jihadist, not if you're Axel Ruda-Cabana saying to classmates you want to white genocide, but if you happen to like watch a clavicular stream. If you start bone smashing, you are considered a terrorist by the British state. Brilliant. Now, Jess Phillips is driving this, as we've seen, and Jess Phillips is, of course, the arch-feminist. I'm just going to play this without sound because I find her insufferable. The great irony of this particular clip with the newsagents is that they raise the spectre of Andrew Tate. And during this, the spectre of Bonnie Blue as his antonym, but his equivalent, gets raised. Because, of course, Andrew Tate ran a porn company. Bonnie Blue is like the arch-feminist. She basically says as much. She says that she's honest about commodifying herself, whereas other women are just gold diggers, or they support the porn industry, but with certain limits on it. And Jess Phillips consistently condemns Andrew Tate, but never condemns him for his porn company, only for his misogyny. Never condemns him for his Islam, of course, either, from which a lot of his misogyny comes from. But she refuses to condemn Bonnie Blue. And I think that Bonnie Blue is as much, and all the women like her, is as much of a pernicious force on civilization as Andrew Tate. Not just because she is popularizing the commodification of the self via prostitution, digital and real, for a whole generation of young women, which is going to wreck their relationship prospects, but also just strip them of their dignity and their souls, because you are performing an act that is meant to be reserved intimately for someone you love, for people that you do not respect by the very virtue of them watching pornography. So you're debasing yourself over and over and over until such a point where another generation of young women equally as debauched will be young and new, and so will just push you out of the limelight. But also because she participates in the porn industry, which preys on young men below the age of consent as part of its business model. And we know this from the sound investigation undercover recordings that Arden Young did. We know this from the fact that the porn industry refuses to comply with age verification measures and instead blocks its services in various American states and lobbies politicians to remove those age verification measures so that they can go back to flogging their wares unencumbered to children. The fact that the arch-feminist doesn't condemn the porn industry, very revealing, and it's because it's not consistent. It's not about building a... And this isn't news to most of my viewers, but in case anyone's new here, it's not about building a civilization in which men and women can coexist with shared moral consideration, free from violence. Place of harmony. It's about anything that maximizes the hypothetical autonomy of women, free from the considerations that they owe to men, being good, whereas anything that disadvantages men as a kind of revenge for a hypothetical past in which patriarchy reigned supreme and women lived in The Handmaid's Tale, anything which disadvantages them is also good. So if Andrew Tate is considered virtuous by a subset of men, even not a majority, he is to become a hate figure. He is to become the Emmanuel Goldstein of the current British state, 1984. And Bonnie Blue is so not to be shunned, not only by the progressive feminist Home Office minister charged with keeping women and girls safe, despite Bonnie Blue being a walking advertisement to the men of the third world who are more likely to rape them, that white women are just willing and gagging to have an immigrant hanging out of every orifice, but also from the Reform Party, who can't bring themselves to condemn this prostitute who does act so sordid that various Roman empresses would blush. That is the pervasive, man-hating, feminist, liberal progressive doctrine that inhabits all of our institutions and has poisoned the well of our culture. Like, we should be condemning both of these people, but the British government only sees it in one way. The entire government is run by people that basically believe in 2014 feminist talking points. And this has now infected our security apparatus. Now, you would have seen this woman in the thumbnail. Most people wouldn't have seen her beforehand. But she gave a speech in the middle of December. She's the new MI6 chief. This is Blaise Murtavelli. She is the first woman to be the head of MI6. And she said in her first public speech since taking the role that we need to be focused on the multifaceted threat posed by Russia, which is testing us in the grey zone with tactics that are just below the threshold of war. So she's saying we basically need to be prepared to conscript our young men to go and die in a trench in Ukraine for NATO and gay rights or something. She took over as the head of MI6 on the 1st of October. So the corruption of MI6 by woke progressivism, the hollowing out of it by DEI policies is not strictly her fault, but she will exacerbate it, because at the same time, the figures like her are saying, we need to beat the drums of war and conscript all our young men to go and die in Eastern Europe. They have been systematically discriminating against those men from joining the security apparatuses, diminishing their effectiveness, and actually compromising us internationally to the extent of where they've, in the Home Office and the security agencies, been promoting Muslim staff, leading to the likes of the Israelis to not want to give us intelligence anymore because they don't want to liaise with Muslims. And this was one of the most absurd documents I've ever read. It was tipped off to me by an anon on X. I've just got to give this person credit. It's Sam, and his @ is @discoplomacy. Solid handle. They first tipped me off to this. And there is just a series of absolutely insane DEI policies being run by the security agencies. So, for example, let's look at the Secret Intelligence Services. So this is MI6. You go down to their diversity and inclusion policies. 22% of new staff were of an ethnic minority background, exceeding the national representation level. Has a summer diversity internship. 72% of the cohort were women, and 45% were of black heritage. They are disproportionately recruiting from demographics who have historically not been the bulk of security agencies, who have not, as native men do, have an investment in securing the nation for ourselves and our posterity, and defending it, fighting and dying for it. And if you don't select for competence, you get incompetence. So we are filling up our security agencies with complete incompetence. I just have to assume if you got in there based off of a diversity summer internship that you're thick. Because in a time where you would have been subjected to the scrutiny of an upstanding institution like MI6, you just wouldn't have made the cut. And this is ubiquitous across all the government departments, by the way. So here's GCHQ. GCHQ's median ethnicity pay gap increased from 9.2 to 11.5. So they're working on decreasing the ethnicity pay gap. That's a real priority for our security agencies. They want to begin collecting data from staff to understand whether there are systemic organizational biases that are influencing how people join and progress within the organization. Aha, okay, yep, unconscious bias, real top priority from our security agencies. They've got an inclusive practice program with 800 staff to shape the organization's culture. It's all just woke, navel-gazing bollocks, which you wouldn't prioritize if you actually thought you were on the precipice of war. And this is institutionally feminine, because there is never the very real threat of kinetic warfare and espionage in the back of their minds. Instead, it's all about shaping an institutional culture, how one another feels. It's basically a fucking therapy circle taking place in the middle of our security agencies. And it just goes on and on. I mean, so here's Defense Intelligence. They have a culture action plan to address clarity, confidence, capability, continuous improvement, collaboration. Because this is what I want, right? The people charged with the defense of the realm sitting around making Canva graphics with corporate Memphis art about just how many disabled people are Muslims that they've hired recently. They've got a behavior intervention campaign. So, you've got to report microaggressions in the workplace. They've also established a neuro-inclusivity network and mental health and well-being network. Yep, let's just hire the mentally disabled and crazy people in our security apparatuses to be inclusive. I am looking at you, chat, by the way. I am sure that you are all just absolutely livid and infuriated by this, because it's actually not funny. It's not funny to have insecure, identity-obsessed, incompetent retards running our entire security apparatus. And I'm saying this because I know they're watching it, because I know the Cabinet Office is now dedicated to monitoring my YouTube output and social media posts. If I did a subject access request about this, I guarantee you get blocked as well. So we'll never find out just how many government diversity hires have been sitting there combing through my tweets. But, I mean, the least you guys could do is super chat and tell me that I'm the worst person in the world. get a tax rebate from you. Then we've got the National Security Secretariat. They've got a bullying, harassment, and discrimination staff survey. Ah, yes, I know. People working in the National Security Secretariat should be filling in forms about how someone didn't make enough eye contact with them at the staff meeting and how that made them feel sad inside. It's pathetic. So then we've got the Joint Intelligence Organization, JIO, rather. So they've got diversity data. They're now 39% female, 13% ethnic minority, 6% LGBT, Tory party are beating you on that, and 10% disabled. Sorry. Right. I don't wish to be mean to people. It should be 0% disabled. Our joint intelligence security organizations should be 0% disabled. There should be roles that are just not inclusive of everyone. And the top levels of the security state should not have disabled people in it. No. Anyway. MI5. Let's go to MI5, right? I was combing through this document and infuriating. MI5 is particularly bad. New joiners at MI5 are 58% female, down from 60%. Oh, we're winning, lads. 13% from an ethnic minority background. Again, white people are a global ethnic minority, but that doesn't matter. It's just about anti-white racism, that's all. They're concerned about the median gender pay gap. They're concerned about equality, diversity, and inclusion. They've got a summer intelligence internship. 56% of whom are female. We're just living, again, in a feminist state. They are building the feminist panopticon from the security agencies, from the government, from the bottom-up culture. Is this making men and women happier? No. It seems to be making women more miserable, less secure. Is it making our country more prosperous? No. Is it making us more prepared for when an actual conflict arises? No. Why are we doing any of this? Ideology. A zero-sum competition driven by the most resentful, incapable people, the types that journalist was, texting me, at the expense of people capable of doing a job, caring about their country, building a community, having moral consideration for their loved ones, sustaining healthy relationships. Honestly, the entire thing's just mental. Where was the most ridiculous one? I had a look somewhere. There's where was the Muslim? Sorry, Here we go. So GCHQ gave an award to staff in the National Cybersecurity Center, being recognized by Equality X as one of the top 10 most influential Muslims in technology. There shouldn't be a single Muslim in our security apparatus. We shouldn't be giving out awards for it. Just the entire thing is a product of the institutional feminization of our entire country. And I've seen someone in the chat say the same. It's sort of a super chat up earlier from testing. This is where the USA was headed to until Trump. It's still somewhat the direction of the United States because the equality law and civil rights non-discrimination clauses remain on the books because lots of these bureaucrats haven't been fired. Because they will be rotated in by the next Democrat administration, who will prosecute the previous Trump administration. And because, not being funny, some of the Trump appointees have this institutional girl boss mentality too. Why do you think Kristi Noem's playing Ice Barbie at the expense of actually getting deportations done? It's because it's all a girl boss LARP. Sorry, it was better when just boring white guys ran everything. Fact. Can we just go back to that? No. And the reason we can't go back to that is ideological. And legal. So this is this article that was doing the rounds recently from Helen Andrews about the Great Feminization. And she uses the example of Larry Summers at Harvard being ousted in the 2005 conference because he noted that there were differences between men and women that were not attributable to socialization. And this then led to a no confidence vote in his leadership by the Harvard faculty and his resignation. And she says the cancellation was feminine, according to the essay that she read. Because all cancellations are feminine. Cancel culture is simply what women do whenever there are enough of them in a given organization or field. That is the Great Feminization thesis. Everything you think of as wokeness is simply an epiphenomenon of demographic feminization. Now, I don't agree that wokeness is not a coherent philosophy in the way that Helen Andrews does, because this is the reason that I disagree with the term woke right. I don't think there's a woke left and a woke right. I think it's woke. And woke just means gay race communism. It means the consolidation of the gains of civil rights and the sexual revolution. It means egalitarianism using what they believe are marginalized identity groups, so non-whites and unorthodox sexual orientations, plus women, as a kind of pincer movement against the hierarchy of Western civilization, driven by Christian heterosexual men. Some heterosexual given Roman Greece. Anyway, Stelios will have my head for that joke. So what they're trying to do is procedurally discriminate, ostensibly, in the direction of total utopian equality. John Lennon's Imagine. But in effect, what this does is this gives license to dark triad personality types, anti-white, non-white minorities, resentful freaks with weird sexual fetishes like furries that will blow Charlie Kirk's head off. It gives them cover, window dressing, to wreak revenge on their outgroup and steal resources from them. Think Zoran Mandani in New York. He uses Marxist terminology, like the warmth of collectivism, when actually he just wants to steal white people's stuff and give it to his co-ethnics and immigrants. So I don't agree that wokeness is just a feminine mode of behavior. But the Great Feminization is compatible with wokeness. Wokeness, as an ideology, parasitizes the compassion that women feel for infants and projects it onto outgroups. And so, what you get in institutions, this spiritual Great Feminization, is it turns every institution into the Longhouse. This is what Lomas was describing when he was saying, this is the remarkable overcorrection of the last two generations towards social norms centering feminine needs and feminine methods for controlling, directing, and modeling behavior. You get social shunning, you get the treatment of the aggressor and the person engaging in self-defense as bad as each other, because violence is per se wrong, because women typically don't engage in it. They engage in covert competition, a war of words. You get egalitarianism, and anyone who's defecting from egalitarianism, tall poppy syndrome, being too boisterous, being too competitive, men and boys in general, they are ostracized and kicked out of the Longhouse in favor of those who are dependent on the den mother. That is what Helen Andrews is describing in her Great Feminization thesis. She's describing the spirit of the Longhouse. She's describing the British government, the security apparatus, culture, the bright pink panopticon that Shabana Mahmood is trying to build. The Great Feminization has succeeded most of all in Britain, in the current incarnation of Keir Starmer's Labour government. She says, wokeness is not a new ideology, disagree, an outgrowth of Marxism, or result of post-Obama disillusionment. It is simply feminine patterns of behaviour applied to institutions where women were few in numbers until recently. Women, progressive women, have been the transmission vector through which the rules of woke morality have spread and been enforced. It's not, as we saw from Scarlett's article before, as Louise Perry has written about before on her Substack, it's not that women are temperamentally progressive or woke. It's not that female modes of behaviour lead ineluctably towards progressivism. It is that progressive ideology parasitizes female modes of behaviour, and so women have been the driving force, the change agents of progressivism, and as institutions have become populated by women, largely due to the decisions of men, by the way, weak Reddit soy boys, then female covert competition strategy, social shaming, and compassion projected onto the outgroup has become the operating software of all institutions. A purpose of a system is what it does, and as progressive women have funneled into institutions, the purpose of the system has become progressivism, rather than all of its stated goals. This is why the security apparatus now sits around doing neurodivergent drum circles rather than trying to defend us against espionage by, I don't know, the Chinese who are building a super embassy now in London. She notes, when law schools became majority female, and it occurred in 2016, or when law firm associates became majority female, which occurred in 2023, this sort of preference cascade is towards equality legislation and ostracizing male competitiveness from the workplace. The same trajectory can be seen in many professions. A generation of women in the 1960s and 70s, increasingly female representations through the 1980s and 90s, and gender parity finally arriving, at least in younger cohorts, in the 2010s or 20s. In 1974, only 10% of New York Times reporters were female. The New York Times became majority female in 2018, around the time that Barry Weiss left to set up the Free Press, and she herself is a progressive lesbian feminist whose sole issue is not America, but Israel. And the total today, the female share is 55%. Media schools became majority female in 2019, certainly English classes at my university, and at universities nation and even worldwide, at least in the West. Women became a majority of college instructors in 2023. Women are not yet a majority of the managers in America, but they might be soon, as they are now 46%. The timing fits. The substance fits too. Everything you think of as wokeness involves prioritizing the feminine over the masculine. Empathy over rationality, safety over risk, cohesion over competition. One survey, for example, found 71% of men said protecting free speech was more important than preserving a cohesive society. 59% of women said the exact opposite. And Eric Kaufman's social science surveys have replicated this data. He prints it in the Great Awakening or Taboo in the UK, if you want to read more about that. Female group dynamics favour consensus and cooperation. Men order each other around, but women can only suggest and persuade. Any criticism or negative sentiment, if it absolutely must be expressed, needs to be buried in layers of compliments. This is what my wife calls the compliment sandwich, and she gives it to other women, but she doesn't. She recognises that she kind of needs to hear it, but she will take direct feedback without it being sandwiched in a compliment sandwich, because I've told her, if you try and tell me to do things in a compliment sandwich, you're trying to augment my behaviour to a way which is unnatural, and if you want me to lead the relationship because you're attracted to me leading the relationship, don't try and talk me out of giving you what you want by trying to tell me to coach my language in a compliment sandwich. She's very sensible. This is why our marriage works. This is why we got married relatively quickly, because she's a lovely woman. Unfortunately, as Helen Andrews points out, lots of women haven't realised this, and they don't realise this because they don't have to maintain relationships with men as men, and are instead, because institutions are filling up with women, most of their social interactions are with women, and so they are frustrated when men don't act like women, and so pathologize men as a category and try to use institutional power to force them to behave like women, or use HR to ostracize them from the Longhouse. The outcome of a discussion, Helen writes, is less important than the fact that a discussion was held and that everyone participated in it. This is where you get the phrase "the personal is political" from Carol Hannish. So, the feminists in the 70s were sitting around doing therapy circles, and they started to become sort of self-conscious about the fact that they weren't doing anything other than just talking. And so, Hannish wrote that the value of a feminist discussion group was raising consciousness in one another by allowing each woman to voice her opinions and feel heard. So, in sharing their grievance, they're participating in activism. And this is a correct insight from feminists, because in having these discussions, you raise the consciousness of the aggrieved party, and then they take that raised consciousness with them, and it impacts all of their other relationships and the interactions they have with others, increasing the likelihood that the topic about which they are aggrieved gets brought up in other conversations. This is why, when your average cab driver speaks to you, immediately the conversation cuts to state of the country, Sadiq Khan, immigration. It's because they're listening to the radio all the time, and no matter the station they're listening to, whether it's BBC or LBC, whether it's Talk or GB News, the topics are the same. Now, you'll get the shitlib take from James O'Brien, and you'll get the right of centre, at best, take from GB News. But the issue is still pertinent. And so just by raising that issue and having that issue intermesh with the lived experience of being in London and meeting so many people that you get as a taxi driver, the salience of that issue increases, and so your own thoughts and feelings about that issue become prime in your mind. And so that's raised in conversations with everyone, and so those conversations become contagious. This is correct. So it is that very real thing that feminism as an ideology has parasitized to prey upon women's discursive role of conflict resolution without necessarily resolving the conflict, but just feeling as if the issue has been vented out and therefore no longer exists. It parasitizes that to put them in a zero-sum game with men. So this is why I disagree with Andrews. I don't think that wokeness is just the Great Feminization. I think that wokeness has succeeded because of the Great Feminization and has taken female modes of behavior and turned it against women's own best interests. Anyway, the most important sex difference in group dynamics is attitude to conflict, she writes. In short, men wage conflict openly, while women covertly undermine or ostracize their enemies. This is absolutely true. All men have either had a punch-up with a guy and then become friends with them afterwards, or have been screwed over by a guy and then eventually just gone, it's fine, we'll forget about it. Like, this is his... I'll keep the guy's name out of it, but he knows who he is. So, when I split up with my ex-girlfriend, someone else in media then asked her out for a drink on Valentine's Day and tried playing it off like, it was just friendly. I was like, come on, man. No, it isn't. And then he apologized, and then he retracted the apology, and we just didn't speak. And after a little while, because she tried to make my life hell anyway, so I wasn't very precious over it eventually, we ended up just chatting again by incident. And then I just said, don't worry about it. She's not worth losing a friend over. It's fine. Like, everyone takes their shot. I would have actually felt bad for you if you would have gone out with her anyway, because she caused me too many headaches. Don't worry about it, mate. So we just laughed it off, and now we're friendly. Pretty much all men have had that attitude. Whereas lots of women have also had the inverse, where a girl has sat down at your lunch table or in your friendship group, and it's been, oh, hi, how are you? Oh, I love your hair, I love your bag. They walk away, oh, she's such a bitch, I can't stand her, but I can't tell her to her face, because, it disrupt the group. And it means that entire group is very low trust. Someone said, it's Piers Morgan, wasn't it? No, I can definitely assure you that it wasn't Piers Morgan, because that would imply that Piers Morgan is going for a woman other than his own wife, rather than, obviously, men going for his wife. I'm surprised that Piers Morgan's hip is broken rather than his wife's, given I think his wife's hip probably has a bit more activity these days. Anyway, moving swiftly on. So, Helen's piece writes, the point of war is to settle disputes between two tribes, but it only works if peace is restored after the dispute is settled. Men therefore developed methods for reconciling with opponents and learning to live in peace with people they were fighting yesterday. Females, even in primate species, are slower to reconcile than males. That's because women's conflicts were traditionally within the tribe over scarce resources, to be resolved not by open conflict, but by covert competition with rivals with no clear terminus. If wokeness really is the result of the Great Feminization, then the eruption of insanity in 2020 was just a small taste of what the future holds. And this is why when people keep being triumphant, like Andrew Doyle or Piers Morgan, about woke being dead, or the end of wokeness, or the woke being put away, as Dr. Parvini has said before, this isn't true, because the organic tensions simmering away in the hearts and minds of ideologically poisoned progressive women, the belief that they are actually victims of historical, all-pervasive patriarchal oppression, the belief that they are the den mothers who need to seize and redistribute resources and give them to poor, benighted minorities who are victims of racism, climate change, that they're all refugees in search of a better life. Those are conflicts that have just subsided to being beneath the surface, insofar as they have actually subsided. They have not been resolved. They are grudges that are being held, and that will continue to affect all of their interpersonal relationships and influence their choices should they enter these institutions, which all non-discrimination laws and equality legislation fast tracks their entrance into them. It acts as a career escalator, an elevator, not just a ladder. So the idea that the Cultural Revolution that exploded in 2020 was just a taste of what's more to come is true. This is why Renee Good was out in the middle of the road blocking her car, blocking ICE agents trying to deport a Somali child predator with her car. This widow who then becomes a lesbian, has like complete crazy eyes, becomes a poet, and gets her face blown off to protect Somali scam artists because she believes ICE are literally the Gestapo or something. You have to be a serious level of deluded progressive who doesn't also think that there are any violent consequences because you never have ever resolved your conflicts through personal violence before. It's all through reputation destruction or ostracism. You've got to be a serious kind of deluded to engage in that kind of protest and then get your head blown off for it. And then you've got to be an extra kind of deluded to be the Reddit soy boy standing on the sidewalk going, dude, you did a murder. Pathetic. But this is a sign that we're going to get more of this. That there are thousands, possibly millions, of women and weak men who have been ideologically captured by the Great Feminization, have internalized it, and aren't shedding those grudges anytime soon. So, Andrews writes, the Great Feminization is truly unprecedented. Other civilizations have given women the vote, granted them property rights, or let them inherit the thrones of empires. We all make mistakes. That's a joke. New Humanist magazine. I don't think anyone should vote. No civilization in human history has ever experimented with letting women control so many vital institutions of our society, from political parties to universities to our largest businesses. And as Helen asks in unspoken fashion here, and as I will ask overtly, how's that experiment going? Because men and women don't seem to be very happy. Yet again, it just functioned better when boring white guys ran everything. Like, the minimum level of sexual promiscuity and impropriety, the minimum level of racial diversity and tribal inter-ethnic warfare, the minimum level of feminine concern for therapeutic venting and how other people feel. We want borderline inconsiderateness, competitiveness, and ruthless meritocracy. With also a preference for the sons and, in various institutions, daughters who have inherited their nation state, belong to the nation that birthed that nation state, and to whom that nation is intuitive, its folkways are intuitive, and who will pass it along, at the exclusion of guests who may well want to participate in our civilization, but are not entitled to inherit it. Ross Douthat described this line of thinking, Helen says, in an interview with Lomez, who helped popularize the Longhouse. Quote, men are complaining that women are oppressing them. Isn't the Longhouse just a long male whine about a failure to adequately compete? Douthat asked, maybe you should suck it up and actually compete on the ground that we have in 21st century America. This is what feminists think happened, as in, and I've seen Chris Williamson argue this before, it may just be that in the information economy, women are better suited to these roles. But that's not the case. Feminization is not an organic result of women outcompeting men. It is an artificial result of social engineering, and if we take our thumb off the scale, it will collapse within a generation. Perfect paragraph. This is what Stefan Molyneux's been saying for decades. If you just stopped tipping the scale in favour of ideological equality against men out of this misguided, man-hating strain of feminism, then you will restore the natural ecology of human difference, and men and women will both be happier, and civilization will stabilize. And at the moment, we live in an artificial environment enabled by, yes, fiat currency. The Bitcoin bros are right about that. I'm sure Peter McCormack, who has been listening to the last few streams, will be happy to hear that I am on board with restoring the gold standard and backing our money by something concrete, so that we don't just have states living off infinite debt forever. But it's more than just that. It is the ideological commitment to equality based on the blank slate that causes states to print and spend money on these causes in the first place, that causes them to pass the laws like the Companies Act, or the Equalities Act, or the Civil Rights Act in America, that systemically disadvantage the sons of their civilization and deprive them of their patrimony to artificially amplify the women of their society at the expense of men, and at the expense of the women who want competent men to marry and to have families with. And it leaves everyone miserable. So if we just restore the natural balance, everything will be fine. But that would offend the sensibilities of equality, which still has a deep ideological purchase. And this is where Helen, I think, gets it wrong. It's that you need wokeness as an ideology, the commitment to bringing the blank slate into being, in order for it to instigate the Great Feminization and to continue to perpetuate the Great Feminization. Because without that ideological goal in mind, you wouldn't feel the need to pass that equality legislation and have a mass influx of women into the workplace and state institutions in the first place. You need to extinguish that ideology. And that's what these consciousness-raising exercises, these pieces of content, I suppose, are for. And this is why the British state is so insistent on cracking down on social media for under 16s, or on Andrew Tate clips, or the manosphere. It's because they realise it's a consciousness-raising exercise to tell young men to be virtuous and to make them aware that they don't have to live like this, that they can be strong, Homeric, courageous. They can fulfill the responsibilities that were bestowed upon their ancestors to build and sustain a civilization, to improve it, and to hand a patrimony off to their sons and daughters. That is what they fear. And so the Great Feminization is a consequence of wokeness. It isn't synonymous with it. She says, the most obvious thumb on the scale is anti-discrimination law. It's illegal to employ too few women at your company. If women are underrepresented, especially in your higher management, that is a lawsuit waiting to happen. As a result, employers give women jobs and promotions they would not otherwise have gotten simply in order to keep their numbers up. It's the Peter Principle. People are usually promoted one level above their actual competence. Now, that's meant to keep people competitive, but instead, if there's no such thing as competition because feminine modes of being are the institutional culture, then what you get is instead persistent incompetence and excuses made for that incompetence, and the people that are too competitive and who point out that incompetence being ostracized. And I'll be careful what I say here because I've signed various NDAs during my time in alternative media. But even one female employee who is not comfortable with men acting like men in the workplace can poison that workplace and put people off. I have experience. Anti-discrimination law requires, therefore, in Helen's assessment, every workplace be feminized. So she says, this does not look like women outperforming men. It looks like women driving men away by imposing feminine norms on previously male institutions. What man wants to work in a field where his traits are not welcome? Exactly the case. If you know that you're going to be punished by the HR girl boss by being competitive, then you're going to quietly quit the workforce. And this is why so many men have become neets. So, this article blew up. And it blew up in tandem with another Compact magazine article. And Compact, ever since they got rid of Sohrab Ahmari, who's now jumped ship to Unheard, who's it for? Has been publishing some really good articles. There was another one on... what was it titled? It was about the recent questions about Jewish identity, and it spoke about Kevin MacDonald's book. Came to some strange conclusions, but it was certainly an interesting article to read. But this article went viral by Jacob Savage because it was about the young white men on the receiving end of the laws passed that enable the Great Feminization as identified by Andrews. And Savage identifies all the various ways in which young men, for generations, were shut out of these institutions, whereas the older white guys, that out of a sense of boomer liberal guilt inflicted these norms upon us, never actually lost their jobs. So there's a massive generational gap between the boomers in institutions, punch my PC, the boomers in institutions who have consolidated their gains, sitting on a pile of gold and institutional security like Smaug, and the young white men who can't catch a break. And this was summed up best, by the way, I think, in an event that happened just before Christmas at Unheard, a clip which I played on my show, where Freddie Sayers and Rod Dreher, who's a good guy, he means well, and Baroness Claire Fox, who's a communist pretending to be a right-winger, all sat around in a kind of feminist drum circle, fretting about Tucker Carlson interviewing Nick Fuentes. And the conclusion that Claire Fox drew from all of these groypers and ethno-nationalists that are apparently everywhere under 30 in the UK, meaningless labels because she was using them flippantly, but she basically meant me and Charlie Downs and Harrison Pitt and Steve Edgington. Her conclusion was, well, the boomers haven't gatekept enough. They've given too large a quarter to the young guns to try and seem hip and cool, and instead we should be further ostracizing them. This is the mentality that is driving young men to be political apostates, despite their lack of political representation. Anyway, so Savage's viral article notes, as the Trump administration takes a chainsaw to diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's a tendency to portray DEI as a series of well-meaning but ineffectual HR modules. Undoubtedly, there has been ham-fisted DEI programming that is intrusive or even alienating, explained Star Wars name in The New Yorker. But for the most part, it's a relatively benign practice meant to increase diversity while also sending a message that workplaces should be fair and open to everyone. This may be how Boomer and Gen X white men experience DEI, but for white male millennials, DEI wasn't a gentle rebalancing. It was a profound shift in power and prestige, profound shift in how power and prestige were distributed. Yet practically none of the thousands of articles and think pieces about diversity have considered the issue by cohort. I want to address a passing message in chat, by the way. Someone says, get Steve Edgington and Charlie Downs to stand with Rupert Lowe. They can pull in so many young men. Downs already stands with Lowe. Harrison does too. Edgington, he still works at GB News, so obviously he's hamstrung in an extent by the content that he can cover. For example, I recorded an interview with Steve back in December, and after Stella Creasy did her campaign to get me banned from GB News via Ofcom, they still haven't told him whether or not they're going to release the interview. So that's now 2 pieces of footage that are being withheld by members of the Paul Marshall Network. So I'm just being censored and blacklisted from everywhere, guys. I also haven't been invited back on since, which is rather frustrating. But in regards to Restore Britain, I do have a bit of news. I should have said this at the top of the show. One of the reasons I've been delaying this stream is because I've actually been writing a policy paper with Restore Britain. So I am going to be helping them with 2 of their policy ventures in February. Both issues that will be very pertinent to this audience, I'm sure. Hopefully I've done some good. I've been doing quite a lot of quiet work behind the scenes, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Rupert's a friend, as are pretty much all the staff at Restore Britain. I mean, Charlie Downs, Harrison Pitt, Lewis Brackpool are some of my closest personal friends, as well as excellent colleagues doing good work. So I've helped with Restore a little bit behind the scenes, done nothing publicly, but now I'm going to do something publicly with them. So, hey, hopefully that's some encouraging news. Anyway, Jacob Savage points out, the mandates to diversify didn't fall on older white men who, in many cases, still wield enormous power. They landed on us instead. And this is exactly the case. He gives some examples throughout this article. I can't remember where There we go. White men may still be 55% of Harvard's arts and sciences faculty, down from 63% a decade ago. But this is a legacy of Boomer and Gen X employment patterns. For tenure-track positions, the pipeline for future faculty, white men have gone from 49% in 2014 to 27% in 2024. In the humanities, they've gone from 39% to 21%. So an entire generation of young men have been deprived of positions of influence in institutions, and so this has accelerated the Great Feminization and the spread of wokeness. And I'm skipping over a bunch of the examples here in creative industries to go to his conclusions. The white men shut out of the culture industries didn't surge into other high-status fields. They didn't suddenly start flooding advertising, law, or medicine, which are all less white and significantly less male than they were a decade ago. White men dropped from 31.2% of law school matriculants in 2016 to 25.7% in 2024. The shift in medicine has been even more dramatic. In 2014, white men were 31% of American medical students. By 2025, they were just 20.5%, a 10 percentage point drop in barely over a decade. At every step, there's some form of selection, a millennial oncologist told him. At Google, white men went from nearly half the workforce in 2014 to less than a third by 2024, a 34% decline. And bear in mind, foreign doctors in the UK are much more likely to be guilty of medical malpractice. In 2014 at Amazon, entry-level professionals, college graduates, were 42.3% white male. These were the employees who, if they'd advanced normally over the next decade, would be the mid-level managers of today. But the mid-level Amazon managers fell from 55.8% white male in 2014 to just 33.8% in 2024, a decline of nearly 40%, as a consequence of all those H-1Bs that Ben Shapiro has decided to support. So in this article, Savage, in typical male fashion, takes the blame upon himself and says, "Oh, I just haven't competed hard enough." And actually, it's not a zero-sum game here with women. He's saying those women didn't take our jobs more than the 50-year-old Hollywood lifers had. The lifers was still there. And I'm not angry at the women and people of colour who made it instead of me. People have the right, in most cases the responsibility, to take the opportunities afforded to them, or even at the older white guys who ensured that I didn't. Mostly I'm annoyed at myself, because instead of settling down, proposing to my then girlfriend, now wife, and earning a steady income that might support a family, I spent a decade insisting the world treat me fairly when the world was loudly telling me it had no intention of doing so. Okay, but it should have. We're speaking prescriptively, morally. You are not at fault for playing with a set of rigged rules. I could barely get a job out of university. I had to create everything. Same with my friends who had to establish Restore Britain because they were shut out of every institution and political party, despite wanting to have political representation and an impact on the governance of their country, because they have no other country. You are not at fault for being legally discriminated against by laws that were passed largely before we were even born. So, I'm not accepting this. This is not good spin. And I appreciate, actually, the sort of discourse that Helen Andrews has instigated with the Great Feminization, even if I disagree with the fact that there is no ideological drive behind it. Let's check in on the left-wing insane asylum for their reaction to this. No, women aren't the problem from The Atlantic. Okay, we never said they were. So, Helen Andrews has said that the Great Feminization is a result of female behavioural patterns. That's not to say that women themselves are a problem. It's to say that they are ill-equipped for running large institutions when they are locked in a competition with other states or other institutions. Competence needs to be the barometer of the success of an institution, not how it makes you feel about belonging to that institution. But this piece in The Atlantic says, with respect to Andrews, in the midst of all this, the testosterone-addled executive branch, but also the supplicant legislative and compromised judiciary that are bending to its will, her essay comes across as someone watching a tsunami roll over a coastal city and complaining about trash collection. Given America's coastal cities, I'm pretty sure Red America wouldn't... Well, they'd vote for a tsunami sometimes. So, to me, it's much easier to see what's really wrong with American culture right now is the slow drip infusion of toxic masculinity it's been receiving since 2016. Blah, 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 blah. Isn't Trump mean? Yet again, the reaction to the resurgence of male competition, the repudiation of what Trump would call political correctness, but what Helen would call wokeness enforced via feminine, covert competition strategies. The revolt within the Longhouse. The response has been, can't you men just sit down and shut up and play nice? It's like, no, actually, because if we continue to play this game, we're like, our entire civilization is like Buzz Lightyear after he tries to jump off the steps and fly, loses his arm, and is sat as Mrs. Nesbit with a pink hat at the tea party. It's fucking deluded, and we are currently at the countdown to psychopath kid Sid disassembling us and turning us into a fishing pole with a pair of doll legs, which was an oddly inappropriate joke for Toy Story, a children's movie. Anyway, this entire article is just seething resentment. She says, Andrew wants us to know she's not opposed to women per se. I'm not. The problem, she writes, is not that women are less talented than men or even that female modes of interaction are inferior in any objective sense. The problem is that female modes of interaction are not well suited to accomplishing the goals of many major institutions. Completely correct. Sophie says, this is an assertion so bold and so unproven that it made me gasp. Okay, it's unproven. Are you happy, Sophie? Seriously. There's actually a legitimate metric. Your subjective happiness is important. Are you happy? In an existential fashion. Not, can you go out and party with the girlies? Not, are you surrounded by people that tell you that you look great and that your opinions are so compassionate and progressive? Are you happy? Are you situated in a deep network of friends and family? Do you have a home that you own? Do you have children who love you? Do you have a irreplaceable role in a wider community with familiar faces that you know every day? And if you don't, ask why, because all of your ancestors did. Ask whether or not that might be the source of your personal unhappiness and the unhappiness of many men and women, and then think, which institutions have deprived us of that, and which ideology infests those institutions that is insisting that my detachment from this network of social relations, driving at my material equality with my peers, and my freedom from dependency on other people and their service to me, ask if that ideology and those institutions have your best interests at heart. Because I don't think they do. I don't think they do any more than they have mine at heart. Yet they proclaim to have yours at heart at the expense of mine, but it turns out that we're both losing. So maybe we should reassess. She says instead, if you wanted, you could blame masculinity for these atrocities and deduce in turn that perhaps prizing fundamental rights and the inviolable humanity of other people isn't such a terrible concept. We are locked in the zero-sum game of men versus women. Women represent the realization of an egalitarian utopia, the rights for everyone, the protection of beleaguered minority groups, and men are just meanies who just want to compete and gain things for themselves and have never, ever sacrificed something to give their money and their time and their moral consideration to the women and children that love them. Like my grandparents, my grandfathers specifically, they were very masculine. A lot of marathon running, sort of like horse riding in the Jordanian desert on holiday, work delivering papers, building brick walls. You know, they spent all their lives and pretty much all their money on their wives, their children, and their grandchildren. Taking them on the scarce holidays they could, making memories, taking them on walks in the woods. Even now, one passed away, one's still alive. No matter what they were doing, no matter how busy they are, they'll drop whatever they do if one member of the family drops in for a cup of coffee, just to sit down and tell stories and ask them what they're doing. That movement from being the strong man who makes noble sacrifices for those who can't bear those burdens, to the elder statesman surrounded by friends and family who command respect, who are organically visited by the people that love them because their time and their wisdom is something worth having in your lives, even though time itself is scarce. Isn't that a vision of the future that everyone wants? No, instead, men and women have to be locked endlessly in this existential battle against one another and no one can ever be happy. It's just pathetic. And then there was this other one from Vanity Fair. We'll wrap up shortly. I've got another insane example of the Labour government to finish on. So this is from Kenny Patterson. So this is in direct response to a conversation that Ross Douthat had with Helen Andrews after her article. This could have been written on excrement on the padded wall of an asylum. The fantasy of the trad wife has been pushed onto middle and lower income women for years, but now far-right social media influencers are inundating our feeds more than ever. Young girls being fed information that the epitome of womanhood is someone compliant, obedient, and subservient. Pretty sure my wife would agree. Sure, even I get caught up in the romantic notion that a life exists beyond the grueling 9-to-5 of our capitalist society. A simple baking bread and caring for children bestows a sense of comfort, but the promise of a trad wife is nothing more than fiction. You have been lied to and told that no one has ever been happy in the past. Why are people lying to you? Seriously, ask, who stands to gain from lying to you, from depriving you of that vision? Because that romantic notion, I mean, people will say, including the esteemed Mary Harrington, who's a dear friend, that the 1950s vision of the trad wife is a historical anachronism that didn't even exist in Britain in the 50s, but it's just a product of American post-war prosperity and leaps in technological innovation. And that's kind of true. The suburban white picket fence is something that was small, in a relatively small period of time. But that's only because the material abundance that enabled women to have a relatively high living standard on a single income, and one where men didn't work close to the home, and women didn't work at all, is an anachronism for a few decades. But one where men and women worked close to the home, where children were their apprentices, where women made goods for the household, where they were parts of, like, deeply invested social communities, that was the norm in pretty much every civilization for centuries. Why don't you have that? Again, I'm just saying to these progressive women, who I want to be happy, because, like, every progressive white woman is our concern, by the way. There's been this safe version of anti-wokeness that says, oh, women, am I right? Basically playing to the peanut gallery of resentful men who can't have relationships with women. And the sons of the third world have just been brought online in the last few years, and therefore it's kind of lucrative to engagement farm them for monetization. Yeah, female progressivism is a bad force for civilization, but that doesn't mean that we can just sit there and beat up on women all the time and not have their concerns at heart. Instead, we should be thinking, what is our place relative to one another in a healthy civilization? And your place is not this delusional scree on the internet, whining about tradwives, which just seems, yet again, like a form of female covert competition, saying, if I can't have it, I guess it never existed, and nobody can have it, and if you want it, you're just far right. And there was another one here as well. There was another phrase. Claire Howarth said, I only had to listen to part of the podcast between Dowhat and Andrews to hit the word wokeness, the right's favourite euphemistic cuss word for equality and parity. See, yet again, the ideology is at the root. This is a female bitch fest, for want of a better word. Sorry, one didn't come to mind. But the same kind of session is had between the likes of Nina Power and Mary Harrington and Louise Perry, all of whom give really constructive, nourishing contributions to public discourse. And they engage in consciousness-raising exercises, but they don't produce the Great Feminization. Instead, what matters is software matters just as much as hardware when it comes to the incentives that women follow and the rules that women enforce with women. And so, if they believe that wokeness is just a byword for compassion and equality and nice things, you know, sugar and spice and all things nice, then they're going to enforce that among their social circles. If you change the cultural incentives, then the female modes of socializing will enforce a different set of rules that are far more constructive and lead to the flourishing ends that both men and women want. But instead, the types of women that run the British government, the types of women that have been commenting on the Great Feminization, are the current ones in power. And this is endemic to the Labour Party. And I just want to finish on this completely insane discourse at the moment over the abolition of Magna Carta. Basically, the Labour Party are facing a backbench revolt, rather. 9 members of the backbenchers are going to protest David Lammy's attempt to abolish jury trials. Now, he's doing so with the guise of, tradition for its own sake cannot stand in the way of justice. And then he gave this interview to the Times, saying that he wants to scrap jury trials because he read Bleak House. Now, I don't believe him, because... Hang on, let me see. Hopefully this doesn't stop me being in focus. You nearly got a Nightwing back shot there, ladies and gents. Look how thick Bleak House is. It's almost as thick as David Lammy. It's about the size of a doorstop, so I don't think David Lammy has actually read Bleak House. Instead, I think that he either skimmed the cliff notes or didn't read it at all. Because if David Lammy did read it, the entire contention of Bleak House, the subplot, is that the Jarndyce fortune is caught up in debates over who is entitled to it during a Chancery Court hearing. And it persists across the whole book, and by the end of the case, the Jarndyce fortune has been exhausted actually litigating the case. The problem with David Lammy talking about Bleak House as the reason why he wants to scrap jury trials is because it's a civil court, not a criminal court, David. The Jarndyce fortune matter is not subject to a jury trial. So no, justice delayed is not justice denied. And instead, your attempts to get rid of jury trials which were codified as early as Magna Carta, but were a product of the Witan, the Anglo-Saxon Witan, the pre-Parliament legislative body that is intuitive to Englishmen, and then enumerated as one of the ancient rights and liberties that Englishmen think custom in the 1689 Bill of Rights. Your attempt to abolish that is anathema to the way that we think about things. But it's done so draped in this language of feminist compassion and non-discrimination. Because one of the saleswomen for David Lammy's efforts to abolish jury trials is Natalie Fleet. She posted this, right? Yeah, again, I just want to give you an understanding of how bad the British government is infected with the Great Feminization. Just how much of a Longhouse, a bright pimp panopticon we are now living in. She wrote, "Spot the difference. Court reform, government benches, women fighting for swifter justice for victims let down by those opposite. Opposition, men in suits clinging onto a Magna Carta myth." You have to understand that Britain is going to become an actual prison, a digital prison, which you will be locked up in without a jury trial, because the feminist girl bosses populating Keir Starmer's cabinet hate men. That's really all it boils down to. Don't believe me? Not the only example. Natalie Fleet has previously tweeted, that was literally the day after. "Some, especially men, value speaking a lot. I measure my contribution by impact." I've even got the little head wave as I'm reading. "The women I can help get faster justice. The laws I can help change victims. Survivors I can use privilege of my platform to speak on behalf of. You do you, hun. I'll keep fighting my way." She is responding, by the way, to Ben Obezi-Jekti, who constantly whines about race issues as a Conservative MP. So we are locked in a battle over who can be woker on behalf of racial grievance mongers in the Conservative Party versus girl boss feminists in the Labour Party. And this is completely obscuring the fact they are destroying the constitutional makeup of England. Not the only one. Totally mental, right? Also, this is very common in the Labour Party. Robert Jenrick gave an interview today in The Spectator. I know we hate to cite them, but oh well. And he said the thing that he enjoys most about not being around Kemi Badenoch anymore is the tone policing by Tory High Command, so the thing you missed least, around his robust public interventions. "This is a moment of personal liberation," he says. "I'll be able to speak much more freely, weigh in debates and questions of all sorts of issues without being chastised for that." Robert Jenrick's escaped the Longhouse, basically. But think about our elder statesmen. Were the concerns of offending women a high priority for Julius Caesar, or Augustus, or Justinian? Was the term mansplaining bandied about a lot during Parliament, during the Napoleonic Wars, or perhaps by the American Founding Fathers? Because now it's just common parlance from the British government. For example, Chancellor Rachel Reeves, who is busy plundering Britain's waning prosperity and giving it away to foreigners, she is most concerned about mansplaining, turns out. She just beat Rishi Sunak at chess today, by the way, so, you know, at least she has one merit about her, mogging India. But she said, "Reeves has little patience with any armchair generals and critics. I'm sick of people mansplaining how to be chancellor to me." Okay, perhaps you could woman understand Austrian economic principles and stop impoverishing our country and stealing all my taxes and giving it to Somalians? No. And then the most absolutely ludicrous example of this, and we'll finish on this, and I'll address the last few super chats that have come in. Thank you for those that have sent it in. Yet again, this is my only revenue stream at the moment. You can subscribe to my Substack and get access to my Substack subscriber chat, where you can talk to me and debate ideas and things like that. Lots of people have recently, which I appreciate, but I'll address super chats just before I go and have dinner with my wife. This is the most egregious example. So this was a debate set up by Rupert Lowe about the abolition of penalties for social media posts. Lucy Connolly was in the gallery. This is the complete inverse to what Shabana Mahmood wants to do, right? Use Oracle and facial recognition cameras to snatch you off the street for posting hurty words online. During this, there was a Labour MP called Emily Darlington, MP for Milton Keynes Central. She's talking to a Conservative MP, Kieran Mulligan, Kieran is giving his ministerial statement, or shadow ministerial statement, and she thought it was a great idea to heckle him and accuse him of mansplaining. This is just how unserious the administrators of our digital panopticon, our Longhouse, are.
Prison sentence. At the same time as the government won't budge on this issue, they are passing legislation right now in this House that will let out thousands of violent sexual offenders out of prison earlier. Very many, thousands of them, will serve only a third of their sentences because they say that there isn't enough prison space, and yet the proportionate response they also say is that we have plenty of prison space to arrest other people. I'm happy to take an intervention.
Yes. Thank you. Would the Shadow Minister recognise the fact that when his government were letting out rapists and violent criminals, they put no protections on whatsoever, whereas this government has brought in protection orders and domestic violence orders to make sure that those people who are victims are actually protected in these cases, and that the prison crisis was caused under his government.
I have to say I genuinely welcome that intervention, because throughout the debate of the sentencing bill, again and again, Labour MPs make interventions that demonstrate they fundamentally do not understand the bill. So if I take you through step by step, I will. So well, it's just an explanation. It may come from a man, but it's just an explanation. So the early release schemes that we...
Look at her smug fucking face. He's talking about the fact that women like Lucy Connolly are being locked up for social media posts, while rapists are being released. Ostensibly, the thing that the violence against women strategy is trying to combat. And instead, she is sitting there trying to emotionally browbeat him over disagreeing with her on a partisan political issue. And then she's got the smug soy boy sat to her right, enabling all of her childish behaviour. If you wonder why Britain is in such a shit state, if you wonder why it looks like we are sleepwalking into a digital dystopia, it's because of women like this running the government. It's because, for some reason, we are entertaining the delusions and the malign personality traits of the least well-adjusted people in our civilization, men and women alike. Perfect image of it there. And all we have to do is disagree with the foundational premises of woke ideology. The idea that anyone can ever become equal, let alone men and women, with their inbuilt differences. We can just say, no, we can prefer competence, and the men whose hard work built our civilization and who have inherited it from the hard work of the men who are their fathers and grandfathers and other ancestors. We will prioritize their needs because they tend to prioritize the needs of women and children whom they look after, and that makes everyone happy. We can just do that instead, rather than pandering to smug, resentful career politicians and smear merchants who end up making men and women alike even more unhappy. We can just level the Longhouse. We can refuse to live in the panopticon. We can stop entertaining these fantasies. And it starts, and you have to internalize this, it starts with the power of saying no. Oh, aren't you concerned about misogyny? No. Oh, you must hate women. No. Oh, you're violent. No. No. No, and I don't consider you a moral legislator. I'm going to spend time with my wife and my mother and my grandparents instead. I am going to build a better country, no matter how upset you get about it. No, not every foreigner is a benighted refugee seeking a better life. No, not every minority is oppressed. No, not every woman's emotional tantrum is legitimate. No, we're setting a boundary and we're enforcing it. And you can enforce those rules within that boundary to other women and children, but I'm sorry, you're not longhousing me. You're not emotionally browbeating me. You have no authority. We're just not having it. Anyway, I hope this was a productive and entertaining stream, ladies and gentlemen. I saw someone say that they stopped watching Asmongold for this. Send them a super chat and tell them from me that he's doing excellent work, by the way. Asmongold is just great on Twitter, and well done on him cleaning his room. So if he's got TTS enabled, send him a congratulation from Connor Tomlinson, one of the prisoners of the United Kingdom that he actually shows quite a lot of concern for, which we appreciate. Anyway, I'm going to read your super chats right before we wrap up. This is from Alaya, who seems to have an English flag as a profile photo, but has sent in a €6 donation. Thank you. God bless for an Anglophile Dutch woman. Aha! Don't give out your location, because you'll have a queue of eligible young men after you. Hi Connor, thanks for your long-form content. Makes me feel I'm not crazy in these end times. Well, I really enjoy the stream format. I feel like I actually flourish in this environment. It's way easier for me to stream, just kick ideas around, than it is to pre-record a video and edit it all, but pre-recorded videos seem to be privileged in the YouTube algorithm, and if I want the ideas to actually be disseminated, I need to do them. I'm hopefully going to do one next week on what the right is getting wrong about Islam, but I have to finish this long-form report for Restore Britain first, so I've got to balance it. Oh well. But thank you very much for your donation. I appreciate it. John Doe asks, why is she even in this country? I assume you're referring to Shabana Mahmood. She shouldn't be. I'd denaturalize and deport her. And just saying that is going to get me spied on by Oracle and probably thrown at a paddy wagon, so I apologize. Just reading some more. Oh, Evan, for $5 USD. I think when young men hear that Tate got his money by scamming other men thinking he had a girlfriend, helps show that Tate cares more about his dollars than brotherhood. I mean, that's just true. Also, I can't imagine anything more spiritually gay than pretending to be a woman, talking dirty to other men to scam them out of money, which he's admitted to doing, by the way. So, there you go. Grotesque. Just, literally, stop gooning, go to the gym, become Catholic, profit. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a good evening. I will be back next week, probably, because I haven't recorded anything out ahead of time, with either a stream on Monday or a video shortly thereafter. Until then, do subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get updated to all my content. I appreciate everyone that's been sharing stuff around and helped me fight algorithmic suppression. Even if you, like, drop a clip or something on Reddit to just, like, farm rage bait, it still sends people my way, which I appreciate. We're getting throttled on YouTube at the moment, so it's dire. You can keep up to with all my stuff on X and Substack. Otherwise, take care, God bless, and goodbye.